Is this on? Can everybody hear me back there? I'm sorry, say again. Oh, this is going to be a good one.
Are these your bags?
Those are not my bags.
Someone left them in here, so I'm going to take them to lost and found.
Oh.
So basically, what's going to happen is that about 10 minutes left in your presentation, there'll be one of my coworkers will be in the back, and they'll hold up a big sign that says 10 minutes, and then they have another 5-minute sign, and then a 2-minute. And
so how much time do I have? I have 30 minutes, right?
It's no,
or
it's
40.
45.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
should be plenty of time.
Yeah. So he'll be in the back and hold up some signs towards the last 10 minutes to help guide you.
Okay.
And then if there's any technical difficulties while you're in here and you need help, you can go back to the back phone and hit 0, and they'll come in and help. But there hasn't been any problems at all. So,
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So it'd be my luck. I'll have the problems.
So good luck.
All right. Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Do I just give you the thumbs up? Oh. Okay. So can I start now? Okay. Just want to make sure that this moves. Okay. I'm going to stand down here if that's okay with everybody else. It just makes it a little bit more personable, in my opinion. But so this topic here is on data loss prevention, and what we're going to cover here. I do have a table of contents here, but this is more so what individuals or what corporations should do prior to even thinking about what kind of technology. I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that do DLP, whether that's network or hosted. We'll get into all that, but that do that. So this is some of the stuff, the exercise that needs to be done before you even talk about what vendor you're going to use. If that makes sense. So for those who do not know me, my name is Jason Samide. I see a couple of familiar faces in here, and we are with a company called Emerging Technologies Group. I always ask this question just to kind of pull the crowd, and not everybody usually doesn't answer it, but typically if you look at this picture and you ask why do they wear the mask, anybody know the answer to that? Because they really are truly anonymous. I mean, we see people, CEOs losing jobs, going up in front of Congress and talking about these breaches, but nobody has really ever said, hey, it's Jerry over here, sorry, I'm pick on you, to say, hey, we found out Jerry was the one that actually did this particular hack. We're gonna put him in jail. We're not finding the people that are actually doing it. We know of groups, and we may know of certain countries, but we never can pinpoint to an actual person that's actually doing it. So that's why the ski mask. So a little bit about some of my slides today. I try not to do just kind of all PowerPoint, so I like memes to maybe make my presentation a little bit more interesting, if you will. So this is what we're going to talk about: what it is, the types of systems, how we identify data, where do you start, and then how do you measure success. So I think I have 45 minutes. So they said 30 minutes for my content and 15 for questions. If you have a question, certainly feel free to raise your hand at any time. We don't have to wait for the 15 minutes. Is that cool with everybody? Awesome. Anybody familiar with what DLP is? Right? It's pretty standard. Basically, it's a solution that is designed to detect data exfiltration, right? Or certain types of data from going from one location to another. Right, and there's certain types of data, and I have it in here while in use, in motion, and at rest. And typically, a lot of the DLP type of incidents, I like to think that are not malicious. It is somebody accidentally emailing 10,000 credit cards to somebody, but sometimes that's just not the case. But DLP DLP incidents do occur pretty frequently, because just through human error, right? Just through the normal emails or things of that sort. So now we hear a lot of this, HIPAA, GOBA, PCI, and so some of these companies need to be more compliant with some of these or I shouldn't say regulations, with some of these. Some of them are regulations, but some of these particular bodies. And again, I'll stress that compliance does not necessarily equal security. from any standpoint. So this is up here strictly because some of these regulations are stipulated by the government and or PCI governing body that these types of things need to be in place. If you're in this type of space, you need to have this in place. Why do companies need data loss prevention? I think one of the biggest things, in my opinion, is it does help identify broken business practices. And what do you mean by that is if you're not aware that company A is sending company B this type of data, that could be detrimental to your bottom line, right? If they're sending out intellectual property unbeknownst to you, but because you have this partnership or research facility or something along those lines, if you don't know that business process exists, your data could be leaving your organization. Finding things that shouldn't be happening. A lot of these connections that either with business partners, customers, or even ourselves. A lot of times people will ask me as a security practitioner, how many times do you run across, if I email that spreadsheet to my Gmail to work on it at home, is that DLP or is that data loss? And to the true definition, absolutely it is. There should be other things in place to where my data should not be in a Gmail account, right? So those are types of other types of things that potentially should not be happening. It's really, you should have a policy around it, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but the DLP or this should be enforcing that policy. So if your policy states, say, we should not be sending PowerPoints or spreadsheets to our Gmail to work on them at home, we need to offer a different solution for that. And lastly, it can save you from embarrassing disclosures of theft. So when somebody accidentally steals emails 10,000 credit cards, that sometimes has to be in the paper that you have that type of loss. So that's certainly not something you want to have out there in the public space. So typically, PCI or credit cards is pretty common. Now, even more so, kind of resonating to the top is health records. I think there's a company that was just breached with health information. Thank you. But yeah, but those are some of the biggest, all around. So certainly something to think about. So the two types of DLP systems are obviously they're network and host-based. Gateway or network host, it's a dedicated piece of hardware on your network, and it basically looks at all the data, typically at your egress or ingress point, to look at all of your inbound or outbound data of what you deem to be critical. So if you want to look at all Word documents or all PDFs or all spreadsheets, so on and so forth. And you can actually even decrypt some SSL traffic with some vendors. And it does increase the detection of malware, depending on the type of vendor intelligence that you may have embedded in that particular vendor. Host-based is pretty straightforward. It does run on the endpoint, but this is where you can fine-tune some of your DLP initiatives, where you have terabytes and terabytes and terabytes on a file server. Where this, you may not want to have somebody have this particular file on their endpoint, or better yet, everybody's mobile phone. If you plug that into the USB, that now is a 30 or 60 gig hard drive that can you can copy and paste anything you want on there. So that would kind of fall into that DLP from a host-based. So you can monitor that physical device, and again, depending on certain vendors, you do have some application control as well. So getting into data identification, this is not discovery. This is more identification, and there is a little bit of a difference. But this is where you identify your confidential or sensitive type data. So not all data is confidential or sensitive. If you're just working with common Word documents that may be like, I don't care if those are out in the public. But like mergers and acquisition type documentation, your financials may be considered confidential or sensitive, things of that sort. Health records, And a lot of these vendors, and in the process, you can do keywords, dictionary, things of that sort. So it's very important to identify your data as such, because if you don't identify what level of confidentiality you want to attach to that, then your policy or your program could end up being not getting what you want out of it. Accuracy is extremely important because you want to identify the owner and that level of confidentiality for these documents so that you can input that into your program or policy to say, I want all sensitive data or sensitive, however I classify that, to never leave this organization, or to never go from this endpoint to this endpoint, or from this file share to this file share. And you can get that granular. Yeah.
So that the advantageous flow of leveraging each other's proprietary information or documents over and over and over, how are you going about in these solutions actually defining who owns it, since the ownership basically gets copied from file to file even though they rename it?
So that's a great question. So identification is very important in the sense that you need to find one person that owns that. You can never have more than one owner of a document. So if they change it and rename it, there has to be some sort of repository that either from a what's the word I'm looking for? As the document changes, it's the original owner that still owns that document, right? Potentially, but it all varies, right? It really does, from case by case.
There's a lot of ways. I know from our standpoint, documentation owners tie back to regulatory oversight within the organization. So if it's PCI related, for example, it's credit card related, we have a group specifically over PCI. Mm-hmm. If it's
So typically that's how you would address that situation there. And testing is recommend that highly, because in a lot of cases, I think to that point, that could be a very unique business case for an organization, and that may not be even an issue in another organization. But certainly testing that flow and making sure that if it is moving from A to B to C to D and so on and so forth, that it does retain a certain level of ownership that ties back either to regulatory or department or whatever that business case
What if you have documents that are made up of data from multiple sources, where there may be multiple data owners, but then you have a single document owner that may own the document, but there may be multiple data owners of the data within the document.
Sure.
Especially as you get more into big data.
Yep, absolutely. So again, another case-by-case basis where it would depend on, once you've identified that, is it considered sensitive or confidential, or however you determine that level of privacy associated with that. But ultimately, either one group or one individual should own that document as a whole, or be responsible for that going forward. So if it ever does, leave or move from one to another, somebody has to be notified to say this moved, or this was changed, or this did something, right?
So when you talk about data at rest and data at motion, normal occurrence of every technology implementation typically is, your whole disaster recovery site.
Yep.
Associated with that. How do you make sure that your rules in these different solutions don't trigger just because you failed over?
Right, and so we'll get into that a little bit from a planning point of view, even going into more of an incident response. Like if that does happen, it's not always an incident response either, right? I mean, if that does happen. The question was, if you're doing some of these technologies, and if
Hello, Geek here. Unfortunately, we had a technical difficulty and part of the video rig froze up, but the slides should continue and audio and live speaker movement should return at about the 22-minute, 10-second mark. Sorry for the problems.
But if that's not something that is important to you, you have to understand what it is. If it's structured, great. Those are pretty straightforward. But a lot of times, unstructured can be a little bit more difficult. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Okay. When I think about DLP, I'm just wondering, in your experience, how do you get DLP prioritized as something important to the executive?
So that's a great point. Great question. It really has to boil down to, obviously, if there's a need for it, right? If you're looking at, tons of data, or moving around. I don't know if your organization, if you have to be in compliance with something, that certainly is a good driver for that. If you are experiencing a lot of incidents that are causing that, so if you have some, for example, if you've been breached and data is left, or if people continually mistakenly email out that type of data, that's another good business case for that. But truly, the compliance really drives those budgets for the most part, unless you truly have somebody that's on board with, yes, I need this program in place because we have intellectual property that we need to protect.
So I think about that, and I think about, the executives, everybody here, the executives saying, hey, I understand cybersecurity.
Yep.
I understand how we need to have proper authentication when our external customers are logging into our website. But when it comes down to internal threats like DLP, it just usually is not anywhere near the radar screen.
So you touched on one already, and one's identity, right? So DLP programs and projects typically are the precursor to identity access management. Sometimes it's the other way around, but typically you want to identify your documents out there, then who can touch those documents. So if you are in cybersecurity, you really have no business looking at financials, right? So that's still a DLP type issue, but now you're tying it back to identity, right? So a lot of times these projects do go hand in, so that all kind of falls under cyber, right? I would say one word, I'd say Edward Snowden, right? I mean, he had access to everything, right? That was a huge DLP incident, right? So again, those are some of the things that I would bring up. But certainly compliance is one of the biggest drivers for those types of budgets. But if you want, I can go talk to him. Sure, I can do that.
That was 2 words.
You're right. So instead of boiling the ocean, it truly is best to start small. Start off, in an area where you have discovered these assets, in an area, for example, maybe it's to start in the HR department, right? Start out small. Don't start out in the whole entire corporation. You might not find might not like what you find. But this way, if you start in a small area, you can discover what you want in a timely fashion, and you can go through and identify what you want in a timely fashion, and you can understand. Okay, this is not working. Okay, you can understand what controls are needed for that sensitive data in the HR. Typically, HR is one I like to start with first because it has a lot, the employee records, maybe some health records, things of that sort. But starting out small is a very important aspect of this whole program. So, how do you determine that? Did you have a question?
Well, I guess one question I have, right, is, so one of the things that you're doing as part of a DLP solution is you're creating a spam port or a tap, in which you're then funneling all that information back to a DLP solution, right?
Well, after all this is said and done, that's what we're doing.
Correct.
Yep.
So from that perspective, you then go back to think of, well, what are the threats and what are the risks back to that data, which now all resides on a DLP solution, and how many of those DLP solutions actually integrate in things like cryptography as part of the actual information stack?
Sure.
Because now I have a single threat or a single location where a bunch of protected information is now all sitting and residing.
Or going through. Sure.
Right?
Yep, absolutely.
So how is that addressed by
So,
the solutions?
Well, by the solutions, so every solution does it differently. And this particular discussion really doesn't address the solutions per se. This is everything you need to do before those solutions are even brought in-house, right? So you need to understand what it is you want to capture or what you want to look at before you bring it in, solution A or solution B or whatever, and do that bake-off, right? So that's all. This is all the pre-work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're just trying to drive them to a decision to say yes, use the product. Got it.
Or even say,
This is useful.
correct. This is a lot of things that we as an organization will do to understand. Then we'll bring in the technology and does it fit into these requirements, right? This is good for creating a lot of the requirements for the technology that you will be choosing at a later date. Because I think to your point is if you determine these control standards and procedures, so that should reflect on the vendor or the technology that you end up going with. Because again, the DLP solution should be a policy enforcer, not create the policy. So you should have a lot of that policy work already in place, right?
You can definitely put it in multiple different phases, right? Detective,
Absolutely.
corrective, or preventative.
Yep. But you still need to understand what it is you're after.
And you may put it in a detective nature to actually prove the need of a DLP solution, so you can actually show your executive management team.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And after doing that, then you get the funding. You can put a preventative or corrective nature in place.
Absolutely. But again, some of the policies that we like to look at from this perspective is do you have this data protection, these controls, the compliance piece? How often are you doing any kind of vulnerability? What does your vulnerability management program look like? Are you doing any logging, sort of system log monitoring, or using a SIM? And this is, again, it's just like an IPS, right? When you put this in place, it still requires a lot of care and feeding, because what you're trying to look for, in this month, maybe business requirements or new business may change that from month to month. So a lot of that review does need to go on as well. And then, of course, when you start small or you've done all this legwork and whatnot, then you have to measure your success to say, did I accomplish what I set out to do? Did I find all the data? Did I identify it correctly? And am I catching it through my tests and whatnot? And not trigger an incident or an incident response call if this does occur. So whether or not we've met our needs, starting small and creating some small wins or that success is imperative. And again, a lot of this needs to be continually looked at from an ongoing basis, for the most part, to measure effectiveness and ROI of the security controls. And a lot of times, this third-party validation is sometimes needed for executive level or for compliance purposes, where you'll have somebody basically do an assessment on your systems or your DLP process. So then you have that third party that understands your data flow and understands your environment and will do that assessment for you. And again, the incident handling portion, certainly you want to have a thorough enough policy that when you do have a data loss of a certain size, you definitely want that incident response to be triggered and the right people to be called. Anybody have any questions on that? Anybody else have any other questions about that? This one? This one?
Last one, second last one. Yeah. When you're measuring the effectiveness of the return on investment, how can you actually measure how much you put in, how much money you put into this process of adding a data loss protection on the data? If nothing was breached, are you going to be able to measure how effective the control is by the fact nothing happened? Or?
That's very. In some cases, yes. In some cases, if you do have, like, for example, a SIM, or if you can somehow measure, sometimes if you have, without these systems, you're like, yeah, Bob sent out another 10,000 records on accident again, right? If you can somehow document those incidents, and then from there, then you go and say, we haven't had that incident before, I can show you in these logs that Bob tried to 15 times, and now they're not leaving the organization now, right? Or you can look at some of these executive reports, or even any report really, and say, we had this many incidents of this DLP stopping those types of issues, right? To say, our solution caught 30 people from emailing their stuff home, or whatever the case may be, right? And that's what you look at from an ROI point of view. And then that goes back to, again, not on the slide, but then go back to user awareness, do some user training to say, stop emailing that. Then you see those even go down even further,
That's
right?
not really a ROI, though, right?
Well, that meant more the effectiveness of the solution. Yep, right there in the blue jag.
You? Yeah. Question. One of the ways I do it is for major events that you identify, and I don't know which industry you're in, but I'm in healthcare. So typically on a healthcare event or incident that requires reporting and corrective action from OCR, you're going to have 1.5 million per event, per incident. So there's your ROI for that incident, that one. So you can tie numbers to it. The other thing you can do, depending on your industry again, is looking at comparables out on the internet from data breaches. Go to the chronology site, look at some of those, do the research to figure out how much they paid, not only in the fine. I think it's just as important to figure out what their overall cost for reparations was over the period of time that they had a corrective action measure. So you add that to that, and that's per incident. Now you multiply that by how many times you're seeing events that you're able to stop, not just detect, and that's how much you're saving.
Yep.
I was thinking from a talking back to business, if I could convince them to invest in something, then I would surely pay it off. That's what I'll come from this question was.
Well, the first thing that you look for, right, is if you don't have any way to detect it, then there's negligence there, right? Especially in this day and age, from an industry perspective, no matter if it's financial or if it's healthcare, that CISO or that CIO, depending on where they're reporting that through, they're negligent, right? And there's tons of fines that are associated with that. So you want to try to figure out what is the cost of the event and determine, well, what is, based on that cost, how many transactions or how many incidents actually have to make up that cost. Then you put something like that in place, and you can go, all right, well, here's the detective in nature. That means we would or do now have to pay X amount of fine, because after you put in detective in nature, just like an IPS or IDP, now you actually know you're knowing what the breach is. Now you actually have to go ahead and submit it.
These controls don't prevent business; they just re-architect them.
It's a process. You're just implementing a component of technology to show what the process issues are in the business.
All right, so what it benefited you from not having?
Yep.
So there's many times from an insurance perspective, right, where a company may buy insurance to pay out those, where you can actually show that the insurance coverage and expense isn't going up as well.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.